Okay, we're ready to get started on our bookmark project. It should already be cut out, and if you did it correctly, you should have the place on fold symbol here. So the first thing we're going to do is take out the pins from the pattern piece and the fabric, put them in a pin cushion, and then just kind of keep this in your bin, or you can throw it away. I would probably keep it to the very end just in case. And again, if you did this right, you should open up into one big piece of fabric instead of two pieces. So if you did happen to mess it up and you didn't cut on the fold properly, just come talk to me and we'll work it out. First thing we're going to do is press out that crease with our iron and make it nice and flat all the way down. Then our instructions tell us that we need to fold it in half lengthwise all the way down with right sides touching. So I'm going to take this fabric and I'm going to fold it in half lengthwise with right sides touching, and I'm going to press it in place and get it as straight as I possibly can. And you can use some steam if you'd like to really press that crease in there. So now here's our bookmark. We folded it in half with right sides touching. Our next step is to pin it so that it won't shift or move while we're sewing. So here I've got my pins. We're going to kind of lift it up, take the pin and pin perpendicularly to where we're going to be sewing down the open side. So make sure you're pinning on the open side through both layers of fabrics. We're going to go down and then back up, and it should lay nice and flat with the pin head sticking out over the edge. Now we're going to do maybe about 3 more. We don't need very many, just enough to kind of hold it in place. 1 more. All right, so here's our bookmark with the pins, with the pin head sticking out perpendicularly along the open edge, and now we're ready to sew it. All right, we are ready to start sewing our bookmark. Our instructions tell us that we need to sew a 5/8 of an inch seam down the long open side and also across one of the short sides. So what we're going to do is place the open side, the side with the pins, on the 5/8 inch line. This is the most important part about keeping it straight. Make sure that the edge of your fabric stays on that 5/8 of an inch guideline. So we're going to put this under the presser foot. I'm going to reach behind, lower the presser foot, and before I just put the pedal to the metal, what I like to do is twist the hand wheel toward me so that the needle goes in the fabric, and then I can kind of tug these threads to the back, and it keeps them from getting jumbled up. So here we go. We're going to start forward a couple of stitches, and then we're going to back stitch. So we're going to hold in the back stitch button, go all the way to the edge of the fabric, and then we're going to continue down following the edge of our fabric on that line. Now another important thing to remember is that you need to take the pin out before you sew over it. So as you get closer, you're going to stop, you're going to take the pin out, put it in your pin cushion, and then you can continue on all the way down that open edge, keeping it nice and straight. As we get closer to the end, remember to slow down and back stitch at the end, just a couple of stitches. And then we can lift up the hand wheel, turn the hand wheel, lift up the presser foot, pull it out to the side and trim the thread. So now you can see that we have a nice straight 5/8 of an inch line. Remember to use your shears to trim away as you go, trim as you go, to trim away all the loose thread. And there we have our straight 5/8. We're going to do the same thing to this bottom open edge, the side that's open. We're going to sew it again at 5/8 of an inch. This one doesn't really need a pin because we've already sewed this edge and it's really short, so it's not really going to go anywhere. You can put a pin in if you'd like. Just remember to take it out as you sew. So again, we're going to sew this at 5/8. When we back stitch this time, you might want to make sure that you back stitch over where this stitch line is, because we're going to be clipping some corners later, and that will make sense later on. But as you back stitch over where this stitch line is at 5/8. So here we go. We're going to put the needle in. We're going to back stitch over the stitched line and then back to the edge, and then go forward and then back stitch at the other end. All right, we're going to trim our threads here as well. Now we're ready to do our next step. For the next part of our project, we need to set our machine to do a zigzag stitch. So when you're looking at your machine, you're going to see all of these buttons down here on the lower right hand side. Those are not the ones you want to use. Even though some of them have kind of zigzag looking pictures next to them, do not use them. The zigzag selector that we want to use is this set right here. So you can see that symbol right there, the zigzag. We're going to push the right button all the way over. And if you look at the same time, this bar is moving all the way over. It goes up to 5 or even 5.5 if you'd like to go there. Anywhere between 5 and 5.5, we'll set it at a zigzag stitch. We want it to be pretty wide, so 5 or 5.5 is perfect. So now that we've got our machine set right here, we're ready to do the zigzag stitch on our sample. All right, for the zigzag stitch on our bookmark, the zigzag is going to be to the right of our straight stitch. The zigzag should never overlap the straight stitch that you've done on the machine. You're going to line up the left edge of your presser foot right here with the stitched line that you've done on your sample. So we're going to get that set up in the machine, and then I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. All right, here we are ready to sew our zigzag. We're going to place the left edge of our presser foot next to and following this straight line that we did on our machine. So we're not going to use any of the stitch guidelines on the plate itself. We're going to use the edge of the foot as our guideline. So we're going to place this under. We're going to lower the presser foot, and because we have our settings on zigzag, it will automatically sew a zigzag. So we're going to get started, and just like any other stitch, we're going to back stitch to the edge, and we're going to zigzag all the way down, following the edge of our foot on that stitching line. Remember to back stitch as we get to the end. We're going to lift the presser foot, and as you can see, we've got our nice zigzags going down the edge next to the straight stitch, but not over the straight stitch. So we're going to trim our threads, and then we're going to do the short end as well. Line it up with the left edge. Remember to back stitch. Go forward. Okay, now this is really important. Before you move on to the next step, you need to set your machine off of a zigzag and back to a normal straight stitch. So remember, we had this little bar that showed us where the zigzag went to. So we're going to push this button all the way back over to a 0. 0 means no zigzag or straight. So after we push this button back over, you'll see that the bar went back to 0. Now our machine is set back to a regular stitch. You can also turn it off, turn it back on, and it will reset everything automatically to the normal stitches. Make sure you do this before you move on to the next step, or you might sit down to sew again and it'll start sewing a zigzag and you'll have to unpick. All right, the next step in our bookmark is to trim away the excess seam allowance next to the zigzag all the way down the long side and the short side. So we're going to take a pair of shears, and we're going to very carefully trim next to the zigzag stitches, but not through the stitches. This is kind of, it's called a seam finish, and it's kind of an easy way to keep it from raveling or fraying. You can kind of see some of that starting over here. So the zigzag kind of helps keep the fabric nice and tight, prevents it from raveling as much. So we're going to trim all the way down the long side and the short side of the bookmark. Now our bookmark is trimmed next to the zigzag. The next step we're going to do is clipping the corners. So as you can see in this corner, all of this seam allowance, this bulk right here, when we turn it inside out, kind of gets all puffy and jammed and kind of makes a big mess right in that corner. So a trick that we learn in sewing is called clipping corners. The thing you need to be careful about is that you do not want to cut through the straight stitch in the corner at all. Otherwise, you'll have a hole in your bookmark. So I'm going to demonstrate here. We're going to cut at an angle across this corner. Yes, you are going to cut off some of your corner right there, but if you look carefully, we did not cut through the straight stitch right here. And that will give us a nice sharp corner when we turn it inside out. We got one more corner to go. We're going to cut diagonally to this corner because it doesn't have a second stitch line. That's the folded edge, and that way that corner will also come to a sharp point.
Before you move on to your next step, be sure to check off your bookmark with your teacher. Bring your grading sheet and your bookmark as you have it so far to be checked off on the skills that you've learned so far before you turn it inside out and move to the next step.
All right, the next part of our bookmark is actually kind of fun. We're going to turn this right side out. You can use the end of a pencil, like the pencil eraser, or we do have some of these dowels up in the cupboard. So what we're going to do is we're going to push this sewn end through the inside so that it turns it right side out. So an easy way to get started is to kind of twist the bookmark so it makes a little bubble, and then we're going to take the dowel and we're going to push the sewn end through the middle, and it kind of gets started going down the middle until voila, turns it right side out. One thing you'll notice when you do turn it right side out is this end down here, the sewn end, see how it kind of is just rounded and it's not very sharp or flat? We're going to use another tool to help flatten out that corner. This is called a point turner. It's up in the supply cupboard. So we're going to take the pointy part and we're going to drop it inside, right down to the bottom. And we're going to use the pointy part to carefully work the corners until they're nice and square. See how that one's square? This one's still kind of jammed in there. So we're going to turn it and very carefully work the corner until it's nice and square. Look at how much better that looks, a lot more professional. Be careful that you don't poke too far or you will poke through the seam and then you'll have a hole in the corner of your bookmark. So just very carefully, very gently work out the corners until you have a nice sharp point, and then we're just going to drop it back out and put it back in the cupboard. And then we're ready to do our next step. All right, before we can sew the next part of our bookmark, we need to make sure that it's pressed flat. When you turn it right side out, you'll notice that that seam line, the side that we stitched, kind of likes to roll and do its own thing. We want that stitch line to be right on the edge, so this makes a nice flat, square, rectangle bookmark. So what I would recommend is you get your iron ready, and you're going to take this edge where the stitch was, and you're going to roll it between your two fingers. You're going to roll until it's nice and crisp on the edge. And we're going to lay it flat. We're going to take the iron and we're going to kind of work our way down the bookmark. And as we go with my opposite hand, I'm going to roll that seam to the edge. Again, roll the seam to the edge and kind of follow it down with the iron. So now you can see how this is nice and flat with that seam line right on the edge. So I'm going to finish pressing this all the way down. I'm going to use my hand to roll the seam to the edge. Kind of wiggle the fabric between your fingers until it's nice and flat all the way down. So here is our bookmark so far. It is nice and flat and crisp edges. Everything's, the seam and everything is on the edge. Now we're ready for our next step. Okay, for the next step of our bookmark, we are going to top stitch down the two long edges and the short sewn end. To top stitch means to just stitch on the top or on the right side of your fabric. So we're going to top stitch at 1/4 of an inch, which is the outside edge of the presser foot. So again, we're not going to use any of the stitch guidelines. We're going to follow the edge of the foot on the edge of our fabric. So we're going to place our fabric under the presser foot, lower the presser foot. And before we get started, I know, because I've read ahead in my instructions, that when I get down to this square corner, I'm going to pivot and go across and pivot and go back up. So I am not going to back stitch at this end right here. I'm going to pivot and basically make a square box with my stitching. I am going to back stitch at the beginning and the end, but the best way to pivot on these machines is to make sure your needle is in the fabric. We can actually set our machine to do that automatically for us so that we don't really have to mess with it too much. This selector right here is the needle up, down button. Normally when you turn on your machine, the needle will stay up as you get done sewing. We want the needle to stay down, so I'm going to press this button once, and if you look at the screen, the arrow now points down. That means whenever I stop sewing that my needle will stay in the fabric, and that will make pivoting a lot easier. So we do want to backstitch at the beginning and the end, but as we get to the end, I'll show you how to pivot across that corner. All right, here we go. We're going to backstitch, and we're going to follow the edge of the presser foot on our fabric all the way down. All right, as I get closer to the end, I'm going to go really slow because I don't want to go past the place where I want to pivot. I want to pivot so that it's the same seam allowance all around these three edges right here. So I'm going to go nice and slow and maybe stop about 1/4 of an inch from where the corner is. If I don't go far enough, for example, I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to lift the presser foot, and because my needle is in the fabric, my fabric's not going anywhere, I can very quickly turn and pivot my fabric. But I can see that I didn't go far enough because the edge of my foot is not on the edge of my fabric. It's not a problem. I'm going to just lift it up, pivot it back, and go forward a few more stitches. And I'm going to say maybe right about there. I'm going to lift the presser foot, pivot, and look at that. Now the edge of my fabric is right along the edge of my presser foot. If you do go too far, you can backstitch. It won't look as crisp, so go nice and slow and just do one stitch at a time until you get to the right spot. So now I'm going to go across the bottom, and again I'm going to go nice and slow, and I'm going to stop right here and check my pivot to make sure it's right where it needs to be. Perfect. Right on the edge. And now I'm going to sew down the edge of the bookmark this way. Remember, as you get to the end, that we're going to backstitch at the end. And now, because my needle is down in the fabric, I need to twist the hand wheel so that the needle comes up in order to get my fabric out. And I'm going to pull this and trim the threads. You might also want to adjust your needle up, down, so from now on, it will stay up when you're done. Remember to trim your threads. And then we're going to take a look at this corner where we pivoted, so you can hopefully see how sharp those corners are, and it's the same distance on this edge, the short edge, and the long edge. So as you pivot, you want to go nice and slow so that you can get it in the right position to go up the two edges. All right, for the next step of our bookmark, we're going to make the casing that our elastic is going to go in so that it will wrap around our book. For this, you're going to need your seam gauge, and you're going to need to slide the marker to the 1/2 inch line. So you can see the little pink marker, I've slid it over to the 1/2 inch. We're going to take the open side, the side that we have not sewn yet, is still a little bit open, and we're going to fold it down 1/2 of an inch. We need to use the seam gauge to measure so that we know it's the right distance. We're not just going to guess. So I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to fold it 1/2 inch, but then I'm going to measure it with my seam gauge all the way across, and once I know it's 1/2 inch, I'm going to press it in place. I'm going to use some steam to really hold it there. I don't want it going anywhere. The instructions tell us that after we fold it one time, we're actually going to fold it again 1/2 inch again. So I'm going to take this and keep it folded, but fold it on top of itself again, and make sure, again, you measure with the seam gauge 1/2 inch, then press it in place. Then we're going to take our elastic that we picked up with our supplies, and we're going to slide it underneath that fold and get it as high up in that crease as you possibly can, so that as we use it, it kind of just sticks right in there. Then it's really important that we pin this in place so that our elastic doesn't get caught in our stitching and it's positioned where it needs to go. So I'm going to make sure that's folded, and then I'm going to take my pin and I'm going to go down and then back up right there in the center so that I can sew this fold right here at 1/8 of an inch. All right, we're ready to sew the casing on our bookmark. Make sure your elastic is really pulled up and inside that crease because we don't want to sew over it. We're going to sew this bottom fold from here to here using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is the inside edge of your presser foot. So as we put this inside, we're going to line up that bottom fold with the inside edge of the presser foot. We're going to go forward, we're going to back stitch, and remember when you get to the pin, you're going to take the pin out and then go across to the other edge, and remember to back stitch. So now we've just made the casing for our bookmark. We're going to trim the threads and move on to the next step. Okay, for the last step of our bookmark, we need to sew the button to the end so that our elastic will wrap around it and hook onto our book. A couple of things you're going to need. You're going to need your sewing thread. You're going to need a hand needle. And when you go up to the bin that says hand needles, there's going to be a little container that looks like this. You're going to take the lid off and you're going to twist it like a glue stick or like chapstick, and then all the hand needles will come out. So then you'll just grab one that you like, twist it back in, and then put the lid back on, put it back in the bin, and make sure that you put the needles back in here so they don't get lost or in the carpet or in the garbage or wherever. So we've got our thread, we've got our hand sewing needle. You're also going to need a toothpick, your button that you're going to use, and your shears, also your bookmark. So as we get ready to sew this on, we're going to get our thread ready. And the best way to sew on buttons is to do it as quickly as possible. So we don't want to have to sew up, down, up, down, up, down a million times. So a faster way to speed this up is to use a lot of thread and double it over. So I would get about 2 arm lengths. You don't need a ton, but you're going to take this thread and you're going to fold it in half before you even thread the needle. So as I'm folding this in half, now I have 2 threads joined together, and I'm going to take the end that has the loop and I'm going to thread it through my needle. If you can't get this loop through the eye of your needle, we do have some needle threaders up in the cupboard that will help. So now I'm going to fold the thread in half again. This way I've got 4 threads all together. And one way that you can tie a knot is I would trim them so they're all the same size. And then a little trick I learned is to take the ends and then wrap them around your finger until it makes a little X. And then take your thumb, place it over the X, and start to roll it off your fingers. And then you're going to ball it up and pull the knot down to the end, just like that. So the knots don't have to be super pretty, but they just have to kind of hold in place. So now we are ready to sew on our button. So I'm going to move some of this stuff out of the way. What I would recommend is that you have the right side and the wrong side of your bookmark. So this side has the part that's folded over. This is the wrong side now. When we fold this in half, we want our button to be on the right side so that it will hook around the button so that the right side is up according to the right side. So now that I know that this is the right side of the end of my bookmark, I'm going to take my button and I'm going to center it kind of in between those stitched lines. If your button is bigger than the top stitching, that's okay. Just try to make it as centered as possible. So that looks good for where I want my button to be. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to kind of tilt my button out of the way and stick my needle right where the center of my button is. And I'm going to pull it all the way through. And you can see that my knot is stuck right there. I'm going to take the needle, make sure that you stay on the same side where your thread is coming out. I'm going to take the needle and I'm going to go up next to the knot through the fabric. Don't go through the same hole or you'll just pull the thread out again. And then pull it all the way through. Then I'm going to take my button and I'm going to slide it through one of the empty holes in the button. Now I want to center my button right in my bookmark. And you can do straight lines straight across, or you can do X's. It doesn't matter. I'm going to do an X because that's cool, right? So I'm going to stick my needle into the opposite hole. But before I pull this all the way through, I'm going to leave a loop. And this is where my toothpick comes into play. I'm going to slide my toothpick under that first loop and then pull it tight so that the thread holds the toothpick against the button. And it seems kind of strange, but the reason that we're doing this is because we need to leave some space under the button for our elastic to get around and underneath. If our button's too tight, we can't get our elastic around it without it bunching up. So this way, this will help hold our space so we can make a shank under the button later. So we'll get to that, but for right now, we're going to finish sewing on this button. So I'm going to come up from the back side through one of the empty holes, pull it all the way through, make sure I go around the toothpick and go in the last empty hole and pull it all the way through, making sure that my toothpick stays underneath my thread. So now I've got one complete X around my toothpick. When you have a button with 4 holes, I would recommend that you do 2 complete X's. If your button only has 2 holes, then go back and forth 3 times just to make sure that it's secure. So I'm going to do one more X. I'm going to come up from behind. See, and this is the other part that I don't like. That's why I double my thread so I don't have to spend 100 years trying to find the hole in the button. So I go down the opposite one. I'm going to come up through an empty hole and then back down around the toothpick. So now that I've got my 2 X's, I can wiggle the toothpick out. I'm just going to wiggle it out. And now my thread's really loose and my button's kind of moving around. And that's okay because now we're going to tighten this thread by making a shank. So I'm going to take my needle and this time I'm going to go between the button and the fabric. I am not going to go through the button holes. So I'm going to come up between the button and the fabric and pull it through. And now I'm going to kind of tighten up those threads on top. I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to wrap it underneath the button really tight 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And what that does is see how it kind of pops the button off the fabric. Now we have some space under here, but now my button is really secure and tight. Okay, we're just about done. We're going to tie our knot. So I'm going to take my needle and again go in between the button and the fabric right through that thread shank we just made. And I'm going to pull through until I have a little loop, and then I'm going to go through the loop and I'm going to pull tight and make a knot underneath. Now if you just cut it here, the tail's going to come undone and it could come unthreaded, so we need to hide a tail in our fabric. So the easiest way to do that is to very carefully up next to the thread shank thread the needle between the 2 layers of fabric about 1 inch or so. So now see how my needle is underneath the fabric and I can't see it on the other side? Now I can pull my thread through the fabric, and when I cut it, my tail is hidden between the 2 layers. Ta-da! So now, in order to use my bookmark, it's pretty simple. Here I have my lovely mathematics dictionary. I'm going to turn to page 145, and that's where I left off. So I'm going to place my bookmark inside the book, close the cover, and I'm going to wrap the button end up and over, and then wrap the elastic end and wrap the elastic around my button. And now you can see that it holds my place in my book, and your bookmark is finished.